Thanks very much, Sam, and thank you for the introduction as well. Um, I'm just getting this to move on now. Okay. Uh, so yeah, as you say, Sam, I'm going to be talking about a piece of research that we did a few months ago on measuring public support for sufficiency policies in Ireland. Um, so I'll spend some time first talking about sufficiency and energy sufficiency in particular, before then describing our research and our results, which obviously, although it took place in Ireland, hopefully a lot of the findings will be more widely generalizable in terms of the factors that predict support. Um, so some background, aiming for 1.5 degrees. So the Paris Agreement set a target of limiting heating to 2 degrees of pre-industrial temperatures. Um, but the consensus really is that we needed to work towards 1.5 because that's the point at which a lot of I guess tipping points become a lot more likely to occur with fairly catastrophic results. Uh, when the agreement was signed, it was so the Copernicus Institute did some work and suggested that if we stayed on the track we're on, we'd reach 1.5 in the year 2045, but their most recent report now shows a speeding up of temperatures such that we're now on track to reach it in the middle of 2029. Uh, and if we do want to stay at within 1.5, um, we in wealthier countries need to make really obviously drastic emissions cuts very quickly. Um, Different modeling studies have put that at about 80 plus to 90% in some countries. Um, and currently, most of our energy policy is geared around the energy efficiency principle, in which we're trying to use technology and renewables to make our current levels of demand more efficient, which obviously is extremely important. Um, but even if we speed up those processes at what would be unprecedented rates, really, we're going to fall short of staying within 1.5. So that's just a very simplistic representation of the energy policy mix as it stands. And what people are suggesting is that we need to add more sufficiency oriented policies to that. So you can kind of think of sufficiency in a number of different ways. I'm not going to get into uh, conceptual matters all that much today, but one way of defining it is as a set of policy measures or daily practices which avoid the demand for energy in the first place, whilst delivering well-being for all within planetary boundaries. So that last part is also extremely important. Uh, Considerations of equity and fairness are really baked into sufficiency policies from the get-go. So generally, sufficiency policies are targeted at consumption levels that are high consuming activities or people. And, obviously, wealthier groups tend to be higher consumers. And then globally, of course, and within countries, we have groups of people who aren't using enough energy to meet their basic needs. Uh, so we do already have some um, sufficiency policies, even if we don't necessarily talk about them all that much, at least in Ireland. So one study of several climate action plans in a European basis found that transport, for example, transport sector, there tends to be sufficiency policies in many countries, but it's not necessarily spoken about that. That's true in Ireland too. Um, but what we think needs to happen is that it's forefronted, and what that would look like essentially is um, it's about things like absolute reductions in terms of living space per capita, for example, modal shifts so that people are able to walk to where they're going or use public transport rather than being car dependent. Things like product longevity and sharing practices. So I'll kind of make this a little bit more concrete, hopefully, on the next couple of slides. So one way of kind of exemplifying what sufficiency would add to the mix, um, I'm using the example here of heating in buildings. So along the top there, you see we have our three different types of policies. Again, this is a fairly simplistic representation, but an example measure in efficiency, if you're trying to improve the heating efficiency in a building, would be adding insulation, which improves the energy intensity of what's consumed. In terms of renewable, there you could add solar to power a heat pump, and that reduces the impact of demand. And then sufficiency, on the other hand, would be something like, as I mentioned, reducing floor space per capita. And that would, there are a number of ways to do that via, say, planning regulations, or another is to have more communal and shared spaces, such as laundry rooms or common rooms or shared kitchens. So you're avoiding the demand for energy in the first place and materials as well. So a bit more introduction to the study. Sufficiency kind of faces several different types of barriers. One of them is the physical environment is often not really geared towards not using a lot of energy. So an example of this is that our housing patterns tend to be or can be in places quite dispersed. So it's difficult to serve those places with different services, especially transport. So more car trips are required. Then in terms of cultural norms, I guess a lot of people would have the opinion that we live in a fairly um, consumerist society in which, having a bigger car is better, having more newer appliances is a good thing, a bigger house to fit them in. Then our political and economic systems are obviously not always, but a lot of the time geared towards economic growth, and you know increasing economic growth is often one of the principles, the main kind of focuses of various political manifestos. And then we have perceptions of climate actions, and generally um, people kind of underestimate the degree of support there are for stronger climate actions. And the reason I link these things here is that to change the physical environment and to convince other people and to convince political actors of the need for these types of changes, public support for them is really crucial. So studies have shown that policymakers do respond to public support, or rather what their perceptions of public support are. And that can often be quite different to what public support actually is. So that underlines the importance of measuring it, and that's what our study is about. So I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the most relevant literature to our study here. So first, in terms of wider climate policy support, as I mentioned, there Studies tend to find that people do want stronger climate action in Ireland. A recent surveys found that 85% of people think that the government should be doing more and that their fellow citizens should be doing more. A really large global study from a couple of years ago by Andre et al., it's fairly famous now, found that 89% of people would give 1% of their income to fight climate change, whereas very few people relatively thought that other people would do the same. Um, but research on policy attitudes is mainly focused on intrinsic factors, and what I mean by that is intrinsic factors of the policies themselves. So whether or not they're seen as fair or effective or restrictive. Um, One of the kind of most consistent findings there is that perceived fairness of a policy is by far the most important factor that predicts support for it. Then in terms of sufficiency acceptance itself or support for sufficiency policies is somewhat understudied, but there have been a couple of really good studies in the last couple of years. So one recent study in Switzerland found majority support for a range of sufficiency-oriented policies. Um, then a multi-cult country one, sorry, uh, focused in on kind of more stricter policies. That was the Fulfill study, and it looked at a couple of housing policies. Um, that one of them was taxing kind of large living spaces, and the other was um, restrictions on constructing new single homes. And they found some more kind of opposition to those ones, the harder ones, naturally. They also studied some others, but not to the same degree. So what we wanted to do here was take quite a large set of them and look at um, framing and rationale and see if that had an effect on support. So the Fulfill study did do a framing experiment as well. So they found that support was greater when you frame the studies as overcoming an issue rather than punishing a certain behavior. Um, but what we wanted to focus in on was a separate type of or a separate way of framing things. So sufficiency policies tend to come with really strong co-benefits. Uh, so what we wanted to look at was whether talking about these policies as measures that aim to reduce energy demand versus talking about them as things that improve your quality of life through health or cost of living um, co-benefits would make a difference to how strongly people supported them. Then another thing we were interested in was whether giving people examples of where these policies are already in place would make a difference to them. And this was based off literature on the status quo effect, where people systematically kind of, if you give them a choice between something that's new and something that's already existing, they have a bias towards the way things already kind of are rather than a change. So the questions then that we addressed here, the first was, does the given rationale for policies make a difference to support? And we also tested whether the effect of rationale depended on the level of climate priority that a person has, whether they think that climate policy should be a high priority, medium, or low. Um, then we also asked if knowing that the policy had been implemented elsewhere mattered to support. And then we also wanted to test whether actual support matched up to perceived levels of others' support. So I mentioned a while back that people tend to systematically underestimate the wider public support for the same policies, even if they support them themselves. We wanted to see if that was true with sufficiency policies specifically. So going to move on to the methods. So we drew up a list of 16 policies. 8 of them were what we call enabling policies, and another 8 were restrictive. So other terminology that's been used for that in the literature is push and pull policies. So essentially, an example of an enabling policy would be a tax incentive to do something, whereas a restrictive policy would be a tax on a behavior. And then we showed, or we selected 6 of those at random for each participant, and we showed them 6 policies in turn. So we had 2,400 people in Ireland do this, and they were nationally representative of the sample or of the population on gender, region, age, and social grade. So our first experimental manipulation was to split people randomly into one of 3 groups. So one group saw the policies framed as energy demand reduction measures. A second saw them framed as quality of life. So this is the co-benefits condition. So the policies were communicated such that they were about addressing cost of living, health, or housing. And then we had a third group as well who saw a combination of both of the rationale. And then our second manipulation was a within subject one. So for each participant, the second 3 policies that they saw came with an example of where that policy is already in place. And then for each policy, we asked people to rate their support from 1 to 7, 1 being fully opposed, 7 fully support. We also asked them about what they think other people would make of it. So whether they thought most people would oppose it, most would be unsure, or most would support it. And we asked them if they'd be willing to, or to what extent they'd be willing to express their support for it with other people. So whether they wouldn't tell anyone their view on it, they'd keep it to themselves, whether they'd share it with people who thought they had probably the same opinion, or whether they'd share it with anyone regardless of what they thought. And we also measured their perceptions of fairness and effectiveness. And then we had a few other measures. We recorded people's policy priority ratings, so whether they thought the government of Ireland should prioritize policy very highly or medium or low. We measured climate knowledge. I won't go into that today. We also measured a range of socio-demographic variables, household variables, mobility variables, things that were directly relevant to specific policies. So just going to show you now a couple of examples of the policies, the actual text that we use, just so that it might become clearer what exactly we did. So one of the policies we presented was about prioritizing high density housing and planning regulations. So that's the policy there, change planning rules to prioritize this type of building that maximizes the number of people that can live in a space. And so for people in the energy demand reduction, this is the rationale that they saw. It was high density housing uses less energy for heating, and it means that services are closer to more people, so that reduces transport emissions. People in the quality of life condition, we're told that this would mean that more new houses can be provided for many more people. And in Ireland, as is the case in probably a number of European countries, we have a housing crisis that's going on for quite a while. Then in the combination condition, those are essentially just merged. For pre-existing example, then this is for people who saw it with that roughly half the people would have. So we just told people that this type of building is the norm in many countries already. And one more example before move on. I'll show you the full list in a minute. But a second policy that we used was limiting one-off rural housing that was outside of established towns or villages. But we had some exceptions here. For example, people involved with agriculture. So in the energy demand reduction condition, people were told that one-off rural housing increases reliance on cars rather than sustainable alternatives. Detached homes also use more heating than others. For the quality of life condition, people were told that building houses in towns or villages means that services are nearby, and people don't need to travel long distances to get to where they need to go. Um, Sorry, that's the other example. That's the wrong text. So the example just stated that I think it was the UK already has this type of policy in place. Okay, so this is the full list of policies. I won't go through them all because obviously there are 16 and it would take a while. Um, but you can see that we had policies covering four different sectors, I guess. With sufficiency policies, some of them are kind of difficult to categorize into sectors neatly. So, for example, they're in the built environment. The two that I just mentioned, they're kind of a lot of the reason for doing those things is to reduce the need for transport. Um, but yeah, then in aviation, we had a frequent flyer tax, things like pedestrianizing, vehicle mass taxes, public transport strong investment. So that one was really making it clear that it was over and above what we're already doing in that area by reallocating funds from different things into improving public transport. We also had then in the electricity sector mandating rising block tariffs, extending the moratorium on data centers in the country. Yeah, so that's just a flavor of them. So I'll get into the results now. Okay, so this is kind of a bit of a summary of support for all of the policies. So what the chart is showing there is in the red bars are the proportion of the sample that fully opposed each policy. Then in the middle you have gray bars for people who are in the middle of the range, and the dark green is fully support. So um, I guess what the main takeaway here is that support was really quite substantial, almost across the board. If you kind of focus in on the gray bars, is kind of an easy way to see that, or at least I find that kind of helpful because I'm colorblind. But if you go down to the bottom, um, you can see that only two policies didn't reach majority of support. Congestion charges was almost exactly 50-50, but it was just about majority supported. Whereas a frequent flyer tax, there was uh, or sorry, it's just the limiting of rural bills had more opposition than it did have support. One other thing to mention at this point is that there was a lot more variation in responses to, so the kind of the negative responses were much more bunched by policy than they were by individual person. So essentially, what I mean by that is that we had very few individuals who were giving a one or a two to all of the policies that they were shown. Um, so we did have about 20% of people, about one in five, give an average rating of less than 4, which meant that on average they were um, oppositional, but only a few percent were strongly oppositional to all of these types of measures. Okay, so going to go through the effects of the experimental conditions first. Um, and at this stage, I'm going to be talking about all of the policies pooled together. And later on, I'll go through a couple of individual policies in more detail. So this is showing the proportion of responses at each point in the scale broken down by the policy rationale condition. So you can see there that obviously the by far the most common response was a 7, so fully support across the entire sample. There was some bimodality in that 10% of responses were 1 on the scale, whereas 2s and 3s were less common. But in terms of the experimental manipulation, this had no effect on support at the overall level. Um, but we also, if you remember from the research questions, wanted to look at whether or not the rationale had an effect at different levels of climate priority. So, for example, if people, amongst people who felt that climate shouldn't be a high policy priority, would the rationale make a difference for them? So this was these are the responses to that question. First of all, do you think climate change should be a high, medium, or low priority? So you can see only 12% felt it should be a low priority, 29% medium, and we bunched low and medium together and high and very high together for analyzing the effect of policy rationale on on people with different priority levels. So that's what this is showing here. So on the left 3 bars is the group with lower medium priority for climate policy, and it's split out by the policy rationale framing again. So it's a fairly small effect there, but you can see it is statistically significant. So those in the quality of life condition um, were more supportive than those in the energy demand reduction condition. If so, speaking about just people with lower medium climate priority, whereas this wasn't the case for people who thought climate priority should be climate policy should be a high priority. So as I say, a fairly small effect, but we think reasonably meaningful given, the cohort we're talking about who have been kind of fairly notoriously difficult to convince of energy demand reduction policies. Then just moving on to our second manipulation, the effect of stating examples. So this had a really small but more so actually, sorry, if I just go back here for 1 second, one thing I forgot to mention is that we'll see later that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in this. So for some measures, for some policies, the quality of life rationale made a bigger difference than for other policies. But we'll see some of that later. So yeah, essentially a very small effect of giving people examples of where the policies already exist. When we look at policies individually, it doesn't come out as statistically significant. So I think, yeah, probably the reason that it shows up as significant in the overall model is just because of the high number of cases that we have in there. But where it does seem to make a difference as well is at the higher end of the scale, moving people from a 6 to a 7, perhaps. Um, okay, so other factors that influence support then. Um, so this graph is showing results of a ordinal logistic regression. Um, so you can see all the factors used in the model are along the left. And then the dots represent odds ratios. So they're just a measure of the relationship between the factor and the outcome, which is support. The error bars there are standard errors. So an odds ratio of less than 1, which is in the red portion of the graph, means that there was a negative relationship between that factor and support. And then in the green, it was a positive relationship. It made a higher degree of support more likely. So the first few rows there are showing our experimental manipulation, uh, the things that I've just spoken about on the previous slides. So you can see the interaction effect there between the quality of life condition and having uh, the opinion that climate policy should be a lower or medium priority. Um, but then just moving down there to restricting. So if a policy was a kind of restrictive policy, people were much less likely to support it. Um, but once you add fairness and effectiveness into the model, it tends to really dilute the effects of other variables, just because fairness in particular is such an important thing to people when they're rating their support for these types of policies. So you can see there that the interaction effect has essentially gone away. So we can conclude really that the reason that quality of life co-benefits are having the effect amongst people with lower priority for climate is because it's increasing their perceptions of fairness and effectiveness of the policies. Okay, so we also looked at political association with support. So we asked people where they'd put themselves on a scale in terms of their political views from extreme or far left to extreme right. Um, and that graph there is showing the mean support ratings that they gave. So we model this and you can see that people on the left are more likely to support these things compared to people on the right, and even people in the center. So people who gave themselves a 4 had the same sort of likelihood to support as people further to the right. Um, but actually, the main point here really is is that people across the political spectrum really like these policies. The support is well above the midpoint um, at both ends and all along the middle. Okay, so moving on to uh, perception gaps. So you might remember from the introduction, we measured not only support, but whether people thought other people supported policies too. So actual versus perceived support. Um, and this green line here is showing the proportion of people who supported each policy, that is, gave it a 5 or more on the scale. And this purple line is showing the number of people who thought there would be majority support for each policy. Not going to dwell too long here. Just the obvious takeaway is that people are systematically underestimating support for almost all of these. So all of them but one, really. Um, and for kind of the reasons mentioned earlier, this is particularly important. Uh, we also asked people if they'd be willing to share their views, and we were kind of surprised that for the most part, people were willing to tell everybody else what they thought about them. this was more likely if you had a stronger opinion. So if you fully opposed or fully supported a policy, you were very willing to tell other people about that. Uh, People were a lot less likely to share a view that they didn't think others held. And there were some socio-demographic differences here. So men, older people, better paid people were more willing to tell others their opinion. This is kind of particularly interesting because it contrasts with um, our models of support itself, in which we found very few socio-demographic differences, which was um, perhaps surprising. So just going to go through, I think probably given time, one pair of individual policies um, in a bit more detail. So these are the two policies that I showed you the exact text that we used earlier. So high density planning and limits on rural single buildings. So I mentioned as well earlier that we have fairly dispersed housing patterns here. Very few, about 11% of people live in an apartment. Most people in a detached house in Ireland. This is our sample dwelling types. And a lot of people living rurally or in small towns or villages. So support ratings. Support for high density buildings is pretty strong. 7 was the most common response for that, whereas for limiting the building of rural newer builds, 1 was the most common response there. So that was our least popular policy. And then just to compare some of the the effects of different factors involved in predicting support for them. So you can see that that for low climate prioritizers, they were more convinced by um, the co-benefits for high density building. It made a much smaller difference for limiting rural new buildings. Um, and then, yeah, people living in more built-up areas were much more supportive of both of the policies, really. But the difference for the limiting of rural one-off buildings was much greater. And surprisingly, as I was kind of alluding to there a few minutes ago, not many socio-demographic differences at all, but particularly surprising perhaps that having children made no difference to support for either policy, really. I think I was going to compare two other ones, but I think in the interest of time, I better skip over that. But if anyone's interested in frequent flyer taxes, we can come back to it. So conclusions and policy recommendations then, just to wrap up pretty quickly. So strong support across all groups. So strong support in the first place, but also, there was no particular group of people along any of the socio-demographic variables that we had that were less supportive necessarily. And also the policies had really strong support across the political spectrum. So I think those are two really important findings, and probably in large part due to the fact that I guess the nature of sufficiency policies is that they are equitable from the get-go. That's perhaps a bit of speculation, but something to discuss maybe. So focusing on co-benefits was often beneficial. Uh, so a lot more for some policies than others. Um, Whereas stating examples was less so, but never did any harm. Where it did have an effect, it was positive. Really, we probably need to test these types of interventions or manipulations with a set of harder policies like the Fulfill study did, which focused in on a couple of um, really quite, I guess, restrictive policies in a sense. But at the same time, it should be remembered that all of the policies that we use here are uh, not on the table, I guess, in Ireland currently. So they are policies that are pushing the envelope. Um, and yeah, systematic perception gaps really across the board, except for on the policy of a 4-day week, which was wildly popular. Um, and then fairness, as has been found before, is was just by far the most important predictor in support. So really building that into policy design and messaging is crucial. And then just some final slide on policy recommendations. So I think probably focusing on co-benefits is never a bad idea, but it is important to test by individual policy where possible before going out with communications. Giving examples of where policies exist is probably not an idea, but maybe giving it evidence that people already support them where they exist is possibly a stronger idea, uh, given that people are more willing to talk about policies that they think other people support. And then avoid assuming low support. I think, in a sense, this is the kind of hardest recommendation to really internalize because even when I start thinking about different policies, I have it it's somewhere in my head that not many people will agree that this is a good idea. But when you ask them, actually, much of the time they do, and most people do want much stronger uh, climate action. Uh, and of course, what really predicts that in most cases is how fair they perceive the policy to be. But we probably need some more research in that area specifically because the frequent flyer tax that I mentioned earlier was one of our probably least supported policies, even though it's a progressive policy, essentially a progressive version of a more general carbon tax. Um, but yeah, that's pretty much me. So thanks for listening and happy to take any questions.